Welcome, everyone. I am Dr. Bella Galprin, Dana Professor at the University of Tampa and an active member of AFAM, Africa Academy of Management. AFAM's mission is to foster a general advancement of knowledge and scholarship of theory and practice of management among African scholars, but also academics who are interested in Africa, sort of like myself. So if you're not a member, we encourage you to join. We're excited to work with GBSN, the Global Business School Network, to bring to you speakers with relevant experience. This is the first of several webinars to follow. Now, I'd like to turn to Dan Leclerc, CEO of GBSN, who will share his knowledge and facilitate conversation about a topic that's very important to us: business research for Africa by Africans. We're happy to work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Bella. And what a great opportunity to be working together with the African Academy of Management. For us at the GBSN, this is an honor and a treat. I noticed that people were still coming into the room when Bella was speaking about the African Academy of Management. And I just want to reiterate that as we go through this particular webinar and we do others together, we encourage you to learn more about them, to experience them, and to join in their efforts to advance what we know about management, business and management in the African context. So welcome, everyone. I'm pleased to be here. And there are lots of reasons why I'm excited about this, including the topic. But one of the reasons I'm very excited is that I'm going to be talking with very shortly Professor Morris Mtambini, and he has for about a year now, if I remember correctly, been the dean at the Gordon Institute of Business Science. And I think prior to that, he was the interim dean for about a year. So he's pretty established in this position, but he started at Gibbs as early as 2014. So it's been about 10 years. What I really like about Morris is that he immediately began leading in the business school. And I think this has something to do with his previous experience, which includes about 30 years working in the financial services industry, including as a CEO of Momentum Investments and as an executive director at MMI Holdings. So I'm especially excited to be here with Morris, who I will call up after some opening remarks. In fact, I think, Emma, it's okay to spotlight Morris as early as now, if you feel like that's okay. There he is. There's Morris. I'm glad to see you and welcome you to this. And the way we're going to do this is I've been asked to give some opening remarks, largely around GBSN's experience with the topic, and that is business research for Africa by Africans. And the idea is that what we're going to explore is essentially the research models that support that kind of research and where things are going in Africa. And if they're going in directions that we think are a little different than they ought to, how do we change that trajectory? So we have a lot to talk about. But to get things started, what I would like to do is just tell you a little bit about GBSN, but specifically why this topic matters to us. So the Global Business School Network, it's a group of about 140 business schools now, leading business schools, including Gibbs, and more than 50 countries. And the mission of this group is to, I'm going to be very careful when I say this, to improve access to quality, locally relevant management education for the developing world. Now, for some, the word that stands out most is access. right? And it is critical when you think about the work of GBSN. Our job is to make management education more accessible so that the skills, management skills, can help accelerate economic and social development in the places we are engaged with. But for me, the words, when I first started, the words quality, given my experience with AACSB, and locally relevant stood out. And it's here, which in this set of words, the locally relevant part of management education, that I think this particular topic resonates. It's one in which access is not only important, but access to what? And I think we all believe, if you're joining this call, that research informs teaching, right? It's not the only thing that it does, but research informs teaching. If you believe that, then it's easy to see why this is important to us, right? Because if we're going to advance management education in developing world contexts, we need to make sure that's relevant. Otherwise, MOOCs would have already solved our problem, right? A professor teaching finance from New York using case studies of banks on Wall Street, right? But we know that's not relevant to the context that we're talking about today. So I've been saying since I arrived at GBSN, part of our responsibility is not only to improve access, but to steward the development of research models that are more relevant for example, the African context. And what we're going to talk about today is this feedback that I've been getting and others have been sharing, that many schools in Africa are gravitating towards research models that are popular in the US and Europe. And so, what does that model look like? I think we all know it's focused on peer-reviewed journal articles. Often there's a hierarchy where some are perceived as better, more impactful, at least from a citations perspective, than others. That translates into a pretty well-defined system of evaluation and reward systems within schools, an interesting market for faculty that cuts across schools. So I think we're all familiar with the way this system works. We were brought up in it, many of us, as scholars. So we're going to start with this set of questions about this particular set of models related to research and how it fits into the African context. And for that, we are lucky to have Morris on board. Thanks for joining, Morris. And
pleasure.
I know I left a lot out of your introduction, but let me just say that we're lucky in business education to have folks like you who have both had experience and continue to have experience in business and have deep experience in academia. And for this conversation, we knew that about you. That's why we reached out. But we also know that about the school. Gibbs is an interesting school. It's young enough for me to know the founding dean, Nick Benedell, right?
That's right. He's still involved. He's still with us.
Which is great. And I know Gibbs well enough that it's both entrepreneurial, but also deeply rooted in Africa, the African context. And a lot of its work has been driven by this idea of context. And so you're the perfect person for this conversation, I know. And I hope it is a conversation. So I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A, the chat. Going to be asking Morris questions, but he's also going to push back at me at times. He's going to be provocative.
Absolutely.
He might ask me a few questions. So let's get things started. So Morris, I know Africa is big. You don't have to explain. Yeah. It's vast, it's diverse. And so it's hard for any single person, for example, from Africa, South Africa in your case, to comment about the whole continent. But from your perspective, do you buy into this? Do you agree that many African schools, especially what might be described as top African schools, have been gravitating towards the US and European models for research? And if so, how as a director, a dean, have you experienced this gravitation, this pull, if you will, or pressure, set of pressures in this context?
Dan, thank you so much for those wonderful introductory remarks. Let me begin by first doing a fact check, because I know that we don't want to do fake news on this particular webinar. So I had over 22 years of experience prior to joining academia. So when you add the 30 odd, I'm now 32nd year of working. So I don't want people to say, but this guy looks 16. I know I've lost a lot of hair since I joined academia, but be that as it may. But in a direct response to your question, I think from a dean perspective, I've been watching this thing called pressure build up, and particularly the notion of pressure to assimilate. For my academics, or faculty, as so to speak, there's pressure for them to assimilate for promotion purposes and to be considered experts in their field, particularly the rating system that we have. We don't have tenure in our country, but we have a rating system called the NRF rating. They need to comply with international research quality. And so this is part of the international legitimation of academics. Then, of course, you have issues with accreditation bodies like AACSB, AMBER, and EFMD, Equius in particular. So as you know, on the continent, there's only 4 business schools that are triple accredited. 3 of them are in South Africa, 1 is in Egypt. We are one of the 3 in South Africa. And so if you are choosing to be a global school from Africa that is championing Africa, you have to balance the challenges of being a global school from Africa, championing Africa to the world, with the challenges of international legitimation. Of course, then a lot of us want to be in business school rankings like the QS rankings or the FT rankings. And we know about the FT 50, for example. And I did an analysis yesterday and found that 58% of the publications that publish on FT rankings have a bias for empirical research, empirical data. Now, knowing the difficulties of finding publicly available empirical data on the continent and the creative lengths that African scholars go to find empirical data, and then dealing with the challenge of leading researchers, peer reviewers, not trusting the empirical data from African scholars, you already have difficulty in being taken seriously by 58% of the FT 50. And then I dug further and found only 2 properly engage with Africa or African context or African scholars, those being the Journal of Business Ethics and American Economic Review. And then 2 more somehow have a cursory engagement, those being Harvard Business Review and Human Resource Management, which means there's 46 of the publications on FT50 that either don't care, are disinterested, or couldn't be bothered. And then, of course, we have the challenge in an African context, given the demands for quality education, where schools like ours have to balance high demands for teaching, where faculty are concerned with having a research agenda. And then if you want to take a 54-country view, if you're not from South Africa, Egypt, or Morocco, meaning which are the 3 countries that produce more than 56% of the publications that are taken seriously at an international stage, or the secondary group being from Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, or Algeria. If you're not from one of those 7 countries, your voice is rarely registered in leading international journals. Now, if you think about it, Africa representing about 17% of the global population, having less than 2% of voice on the global stage of business education research is embarrassing. and shocking, and should force us all to kind of reflect about what is going on here. On the positive side, we know that the IDRC, the Canadians, for example, challenged the narrow definition of quality, and they've launched something called Research Quality Plus, which is a very substantive way of dealing with research quality and does away with a lot of the games that are played in the research quality game in the global north, which then plague those of us that are in the global south. So you can see that as a dean or a director, you've got a lot to deal with. You want to be legitimate, you want to be international, but at the same time, you're managing different challenges in the African context. Hope that helps, Dan.
Yeah. Boy, I made a few notes here. And I want to come back to one, but I want to first comment that Bella's not on the screen anymore, but she's Canadian, and she would be proud that the Canadians are taking a lead and trying to better understand the quality. And Benson Honig, who's also working with the AFAM group, is based in Canada at McMaster University. So it's interesting to see how Canada may emerge as a place that helps us to value the work of scholars around the world.
I do want to stay there a little bit, Dan, and say Canada is helpful on a number of fronts. So I'll give an example using South African stats. Doctorate qualified academics at business schools hover around 60%. And then leading schools like ourselves, Stellenbosch and UCT, we hover over 80%. So we are privileged because we've got lots of doctorate qualified, but the bulk of our peers operating at a much lower level. IDRC comes in and says, funds people like us to partner with universities, not only in South Africa, but on the continent. We've been doing this since I started at Gibbs at the very least, working with scholars in West Africa and East Africa and North Africa, as well as South Africa, to produce doctorally qualified academics with doctoral degrees from our university, University of Pretoria. And that has a lot to do with the mission that organizations like the IDRC, as one of the several Canadian institutions that are driving real, what I call substantive justice in the intellectual knowledge creation field of higher education.
That's interesting. I want to come back to that in a while because we, for example, have been in conversations with a great school called the Jönköping International Business School, who's worked for decades through the Swedish government to try to support doctoral education. And one of the overarching conclusions is that absent also an investment in helping to shape the culture of research in schools, that often that investment doesn't produce the kind of results that we're looking for. So we come back to that, I think, in a minute. But it's not only hard for schools, for deans and directors like yourself, Morris, but you hinted at least that this is a difficult challenge for scholars. It seems to me like what you were saying is that, if you're a scholar on the continent and you're trying to do the right things as it relates to what pressures that the school is facing, that it's quite a bit harder. Could you expand on that a little bit and talk a little bit more about what you see these pressures meaning for faculty that you work with?
Certainly. So I did indicate first and foremost a structural issue within an African context where the funding model for higher education institutions favors and rewards teaching much more than it rewards research. So the grant funding, particularly for public institutions, for research will be 10%, versus research teaching grant funding will be 90%. So the funding model doesn't encourage scholars to to have the right appropriate balance between teaching and research. And then whilst you're sitting at that, then you're sitting with limited research funding for critical areas, even where third parties like the European Union or USAID, Fulbright scholarships, or even our friends from Canada, even where they do fund for critical research like climate change, for example. I mean, we know that African countries as a whole, or the continent as a whole, has the least to account for climate change challenges that we face in the world, but many of the people that are based on this continent will pay the heaviest price for, and are already paying the heaviest price. Yet, it may surprise you, I read an article yesterday by Indra Overland and her co-authors, which says that despite being home to 17% of the global population, at most only 3.8% of research funding from the global north is spent on African topics, especially in climate change. But what is more shocking is not the 3.8%, but of that 3.8% of global funding, 78% is washed through European and North American schools, which means African institutions get at best the balance, but in realistically they calculate it's only about 14%. The rest of the world gets the balance, right? So you've got a funding problem that is challenging the scholar. The second thing that is challenging the scholar is even when they do partner with scholars from the global north, that relationship is unequal. Firstly, if I were working in a school in Europe and I was in France and I was partnering with a colleague in Germany or in England, that is international collaboration of high quality. But if I'm working in a school in South Africa and I'm partnering with a colleague from Malawi, somehow that is not perceived by the editors as of equal value. So for my legitimation, I need to go and partner with the global north. I think that is a challenge that needs to be overcome. Then of course, there is real racial and gender inequality in journals. So an article again by Fengyan Liu says that 14% of editors and 8% of editors-in-chief, for example, are women. And then James Salazar says 75% of medical journals are edited by white males. And then we know that research from Africa, Asia, and South America accounts for about 35% of authors, but only 19% of editors. So what you're dealing with here is what I would term intellectual injustice, being the third issue that is affecting scholars. But not all is lost, Dan, because there's issues we can do to address this intellectual injustice. So we'll talk about this later, I'm sure. But some of it is there are initiatives called the Citation Justice Initiative. There is Citation Transparency Plug.in. There's Gender Citation Balance Index. So there's tools that are out there that those of us that are interested in redressing intellectual injustice, we can use to amplify citations of underrepresented communities and scholars from underrepresented geographies like the African continent.
Wow, we knew you would bring interesting ideas, but also interesting data is really key, some of which I haven't heard before. But I don't want to dwell on this too long, but I wonder, maybe we could also talk a little bit about something you referenced a little bit earlier, and that is really about the methods that are often more appreciated in the top journals and how they fit. For example, it seems to me like even the journals that you referenced that do have some attachment to Africa are often more interested in publishing papers that are sort of generalizable in a sort of a global context, and not always interested in things that are more specific to context, right? So even if you have even if you were to solve some of the data quality challenges in the context of Africa and publish one that's more specific to the context, or try to publish, it's often difficult to get it into those journals. But also this set of ideas where we focus on more deductive reasoning in our articles rather than more inductive, or what I appreciate, for example, the Academy of Management Discovery's approach in looking at what they call abductive research, which seeks to highlight new phenomena or existing phenomena that might not be understood well in the context of existing theory. And it seems to me all of these things like field research, ethnographic research, all of these things would add to our knowledge about management rather than subtract from it, but are not really appreciated. I don't know if that's just a comment or if that's something you want to reflect back on or talk about a little bit. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment. So we're entering into the realm of politics and where scholarship is today and what drives that scholarship. So when I think about context, I go to Anne Tsui's categorization of context in scholarly research, where she talks about 3 categories. Context-free, universalistic research is one context, and that's the dominant view. And then there's context-bound, which is where you are comparing different contexts. You take context into consideration, but you are comparing context. And then context-specific, which is grounded in one type of context. Turns out that the third category is the least category that is represented in leading journals. The first one is the most dominant one, so they go in that order of importance. And even where African scholars have data that can be considered useful in the context-free environment, like entrepreneurial research, for example, a subfield, editors, reviewers struggle to take that data seriously compared to entrepreneurial research in Europe, entrepreneurial research in North America. And so it seems like the problem around context is complex. So one is take African data seriously across each of those buckets. That should be a starting point to kind of decide, without necessarily changing the nature of the buckets if you so wish. And once you've done that, then start asking the question, why do you need to legitimize a Morris with a Den Leclerc? So for example, if you don't mind, I will comment on jokingly, I was preparing for this. I don't know if you've heard of William Hoover, a US physicist. Have you heard of him?
No, I haven't. I'm sure
so
he's
a well-researched and well-cited physicist who in the 80s submitted 2 great papers to journals that I won't mention, and they rejected him. And he explained to one of his friends, because he was in Italy at the time, this is what happened. And he explained that he kept on hearing these Italian women talking about mentioning 2 terms, and one of them, it's a bit vulgar, it's called stronze bestiali. It was the name, a word he kept on hearing, and then the guy said, well, why don't you add stronze bestiali as your co-author and resubmit your papers to the very same journals? He did that, and he changed the title. It didn't change anything else. The papers he did it as a joke to insult the editors. They actually published both papers. And these stronza bestiale is not a human being, it's an insult. It took them for a long time to work out what had gone on. They've tried to delete them, but actually people are still referencing this person. So where am I going with this? I'm suggesting that in the game of quality, there are games that are dysfunctional. There are games that are unhelpful. So we know, for example, single authored papers are not as referenced as triple authored papers. So people then make up additional authors so that they can drive up their citation. So there's citation ethics issues that are being played out there. And so for me, I'm saying we need to challenge how quality is assessed today and move from this formulaic quality measurements that result in unhelpful outcomes and move to more substantive justice quality measurements. And that's when, Dan, your comments about whether you're moving from deductive and abductive and all other forms of research can then be taken into consideration and be valued in their fullness, as opposed to being dichotomized and be ranked in some form of hierarchy as to which form of knowledge is more important than the other.
Wow, there's so much to what you've given us in that response, Morris, and there's some recurring themes I know that we'll revisit. And I want to highlight that we've gotten a question in the Q&A, but I think we're going to get to this, Maureen. This is for you about, maybe some potential solutions or how deans and others have begun to navigate some of these questions. But before we get there, I want to ask a question about what we lose, right? So when I say what we lose, it seems to me part of what you're saying is that the systems that we are gravitating towards are not necessarily working the way we would like them to work. Ideally, right? Ideally, the systems we have for research feed education, right? They inform practice and they inform policy. They're relevant to all three, right? But they also serve a function within the school of, sort of connecting to and aligning with what the school is trying to achieve, right? In the context in which it operates. And ideally, it supports a vibrant market for faculty members in some way, right? And a ecosystem of journals and things like that that produce scholarship that's objective, that's credible. So there's a lot that we want from a system of research. And one can argue, and you referenced Ann Sui earlier, who's led a movement. I'm a founding member of the movement called the Responsible Research in Business and Management. And so part of the challenge is how do we get more out of the system by either tweaking it or reforming it and things like that. But I want to be specific to Africa. I want to explore with you, what are we losing as a consequence of African schools moving towards or gravitating towards this US or European system for research?
So let me kick off first with an earlier comment you made about research informing teaching, right? So at a curricular level, if research is informing teaching, and most of the research, whether it's journal articles or those of us that follow the case method, teaching cases that are peer-reviewed, that are from the global north, don't reflect the reality on the ground, means that if we use those as the only source of teaching, as the only source of research that is informing our teaching, the teaching that we are doing is not helpful for those of us that are operating on the African continent. So by doing that and only relying on that type of work, we are affecting the quality of our teaching. Conversely, by not producing research about Africa and from Africa at a time where very soon Africa will represent a quarter of the population in the world in our lifetime, right? A quarter of the population will be African. The bulk of the positive and negative opportunities will be in Africa, meaning those of us in the rest of the world that are seeking to trade with, do business with, engage with Africa, if we're not getting material from this continent, we are going back 500 years in not actually knowing. We're flying blind into the continent. So I think that's a really important point. What we also lose is by going towards what's happening in Europe and North America is we're getting very good at clear and very narrow discipline-based research, but we're missing out on researching the mess and the breadth of transdisciplinary research. Research that is demanded by this complex institutional environment in which we find ourselves. Of course, we've heard about this concept of institutional voids, whether they are financial institutional voids, human capital institutional voids, educational institutional voids, or technical to institutional voids. We're missing the opportunity of advancing theory that was learned in a different context and being tested, evaluated, challenged in these various contexts that you find on the continent. And so accepting an acontextual received wisdom and without thought is problematic. And I believe by challenging challenging that acontextual wisdom against our unique realities in Africa could advance theory, could lead to new theory, could help us to think about institutional mechanisms in a very different way, and because in business, people don't rely on government and government regulations and contracting mechanisms as much in Africa as they would do in the global north, for example. And yet businesses are thriving on this continent. So what are they doing that the rest of the world doesn't know about, And so for me, we're also losing if we go blindly into this narrow assimilation process. We are continuing the colonization project, and we are really missing out on some amazing scholars and some amazing scholarship from, as you said, people that have on the ground knowledge. These are not people that are number crunching, doing stuff that an AI can do quicker than a human being. These people are doing something that is really value creating, advancing humanity. So I think we lose something of ourselves as a humanity by continuing to exclude scholars like ourselves from those important conversations by virtue of the politics of scholarship, the politics of journal article.
Well, you said you'd be provocative, and I think we've heard several very provocative comments from you during that discussion. I want to turn to the Q&A and the chat to make sure we integrate these. And there's a few questions that are about what I think we'll get to very shortly, and that is, what do we do about this challenge? How do we navigate forward in a way that creates better outcomes for the world as well as for Africa? But before we do that, Elisa Rokundo asks, how do you define the undermining of cultural values? Because you were just talking about this, and I hadn't thought about this much, but how do you define the undermining of cultural values as well as the research related to youth engagement and its long-term preservation? So I think this is what you're referring to, right? How do we capture more of what makes Africa, Africa, rather than less? You want to comment on that?
So gently, if I can say gently. So I have colleagues that are experts in the business community in fields like indigenous knowledge creation, and they're well placed to comment, because I think it sounds like a simple question, but it's a deep question. It's a complex question that is being put to us. But if I could potentially problematize it as follows, that I think the legitimization process that happens in the peer review process assumes a universalistic culture and a universalistic approach to values. And as a consequence, anything that does not fit that gets rejected, gets put up against much more scrutiny than is reasonable, and has to jump through much greater hoops. So part of answering the question is how might we overcome such challenges? This is happening in other fields. It's happening in the fields that we study. So you have people that have had to deal with women in the workplace, women as leaders. In North America, I would be considered a minority. In Africa, I'm the majority. So depending on where you come from, people like myself who are underrepresented in leadership positions. So our community that we're studying have shown us that you have to conscientize yourself. You have to be made aware. You have to learn the tools to deal with your own prejudices. And yet, these diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging concepts that we see in our students, we teach in our students, we don't teach in ourselves. So how we might overcome it for me is for editorial boards to take up a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging statement and a program of action, and challenge themselves. I don't know if we were at the same time. No, I don't think we were last year, Dan, because I met with you in New York. But before meeting with you in New York, I was at Princeton and I was attending a conference on responsible research and management. There were a few editors of leading journals that I won't mention here, but these are all top 50 journals. And I asked them the following questions. On your editorial boards, how many scholars do you have that are either born in Africa or based in Africa, or both? And the response was shocking. And then I said, given that, are you then surprised that your publications do not have the appreciation and understanding of the knowledge and the data and the value of the research that is coming from the African continent? So for me, again, it really begins with being intentional about these issues. So I hope that helps.
It does very much so, Morris. But we want to talk now about how to overcome these challenges. You know, we don't expect you to have all the answers, don't worry, although I suspect you have many. But in the process, there are again a few questions that I think we'd love for you to touch on. You know, one Maureen asked very early on is, you know, what role does funding and workload potentially play in addressing this challenge? There's a question from Anonymous about injustice, and how do we deal specifically with that point about unconscious or even conscious injustice when it comes to scholarship? There's a point made in the chat about intra-African collaboration, and how might that be a sort of a way to overcome or deal with this challenge. And then there's a point about organizations like the Academy of Management and its leadership role in helping us to navigate these. Sorry, I piled a lot on you there.
It's a lot. So just remind me. So let's start with the easy one that I remember. let's talk about intra-African, because I think that's a good place to start. First and foremost, we have organizations like FM, the African Academy of Management. I think they're important organizations that provide leadership in this space. Then we have the 83-member African Association of Business Association of African Business Schools, ABS. And then we have the association that I'm also a part of. Incidentally, Gibbs was a founder member of both ABS as well as SABSA, which is the South African Business School Association with about 26 member schools. And then we have another organization that I've been part of recently is Business Schools for Climate Leadership Africa, which is partnering with Business School for Climate Leadership Europe. And a whole host of other organizations that we could lean into. So in other words, there are institutional mechanisms in place that facilitate collaboration, intra-Africa collaboration. And through those mechanisms, schools, because I saw another question earlier, how is Gibbs facilitating this on the continent? We are working through those platforms to facilitate joint research, joint fundraising initiatives and funding initiatives, joint conferences, South Africa, Morocco, and Egypt, for example, and Kenya and Nigeria. Those are the main geographies where we're collaborating. Ghana is another one. And so there's a lot that is happening on the ground, and I'd be very happy to share those with you, Dan, to distribute to the community to the extent that member schools of GBSN also want to tap in and partner with us. The comment then I would make there is that seeking to have equal partnerships, firstly, those of us in the continent need to rebalance the South-South collaboration to be of equal value. And then we also need to rebalance the South-North relationship so that when we are collaborating together, whether it's for fundraising or for research, we do so as equal partners and in a transparent way. And certainly at Gibbs, if I look at some of our relationship, for example, with Harvard Business School, it's a proper collaboration. All the costs are put out. We all sign off on all the costs and all the revenue and everything. HBS is wonderful, and as prestigious as they are, they don't treat us as one from the colonies. They treat us as an equal partner. And so for me, I'm saying they are examples of what I'm talking about. I'm just flagging the things that we should be thinking about. So that deals with that. I think two of the questions, Dan. Please remind me of the others. I think you're on mute, Dan.
Sorry, I knew that would happen at least once during every event. But specifically, there was the question about faculty workload, but there was also the question about this either conscious or unconscious injustice towards African scholarship.
Certainly.
Yeah.
So look, to be honest, the one on faculty workload, I don't think is going to be an easy one to solve on day one. Each school, each country does need to solve system issues. In the meantime, what we are doing is we have divided, we have a faculty model, for example, where we've got teaching intensive faculty and research intensive faculty. And they cross-subsidize each other, these two groups of faculty. And then we monetize our research because we've got a very strong executive education component. We then monetize our research on the executive education side to make up for the funding shortfalls from those research intensive faculty. So we have found a solution, but I think that's a Gibbs solution. It's not going to be accessible to every business school on the continent. And we've been very lucky to have arrived there first before others, so we'll still have a competitive advantage. But I would be very glad to share some of these thoughts with any of my colleagues on the continent. because at the end, they'll need to find their own solutions. But all of these are short-term solutions. Long-term, we need system-level changes to happen at a government level to address funding, right? And then how we then think about partnerships with those research-intensive faculty also opens up other opportunities for engagement. You mentioned two, so I keep forgetting. My mind is not working well.
Actually, you referenced this earlier, that we would talk about it a little bit when you were talking about the injustice, either
injustice
or unconscious about, and you said that there are some movements or initiatives underway that might help us to address that.
Yeah, so I suppose the injustice begins firstly, these reviewers are human beings, editors are human beings. I could talk about an example of research by my colleagues who were talking about racial inequality in the workplace. And you would think, if you know as an editor that somebody is saying, I'm writing about racial inequality in the workplace using data from South Africa, you would have some understanding of the historical context. They were asked to revise and resubmit and take out reference to race, because the editor said, we don't think race is a problem any longer in this country, in the world. This is 2019, before George Floyd. Personally, I had an article in an international corporate governance journal that I submitted. And one of the comments I got back was, we're really happy to approve. So mine was context-bound research. It was research done, which I thought was quite clever, in what I'd call the advanced developing world and the advanced developing world, contrasting the two. So I'd collected data in South Africa and Zimbabwe, being the advanced and less advanced developing world, and then in Sweden and Poland, for example. So Netherlands and Poland being contrasting those two, Eastern and Western Europe. And I was told by those editors that I needed to add data from China. I said, but that's not the phenomenon I'm investigating. So you have a scenario where these human beings bring their own prejudices. It turned out that my reviewers, I could work out, were all Chinese in that particular journal. And in the other one, they had their own issues. They just didn't want to deal with race in the other journal. So again, I think I've already started talking about it to say, unless editors and editorial teams not only have a policy, but have a program of action to deal with intellectual injustice, this problem will continue to thrive. And when it thrives, it means that phenomenon around that helps us to understand how we can reconceptualize new social relationships are missed. And yeah, so I think for me, there's a missed opportunity if we don't do that. I've got other ideas. I see we've got a few minutes left, 6 minutes. I've got other ideas that I could share around how ABS and GBSN and FM might have a program of action, because I think I want to be provocative in talking about a program of action going forward. We mustn't just be a talk shop. We must agree one or two things that we could take forward together.
I like that very much. But as you've noted, we have only now 5 minutes left, and outlining a program of action might be a little bit beyond the scope, but I hope you've been able to pay attention a little bit more to the chat. We've had a lot of really supportive comments. It was great to see Peter Bemkeli here. Bemke, it's great to see you, and his comment about South-South collaboration supporting your ideas. And we think this is especially important as well. And our impact communities are many of them are driven by this idea of facilitating this South-South collaboration, not just within Africa, but between Africa and South America and parts of Asia. And again, very supportive comments about your points about race and inequality, and also some useful comments about how there are some journals, encouraging people to look at the AFAM journal and consider the conference that's coming up. But just to close us in this conversation, since it's been brought up, you know, you even brought up earlier that part of what's happening is this globalization of accreditation, right? You're triple accredited, and that's one reason why you're here. But also, you've suggested as a consequence how powerful these organizations can be in our industry. AACSB, EFMD, the third part is, of course, AMBA. And I wonder if you could just comment as we depart about some ways that you think these organizations can be more helpful in creating a system that appreciates as much what's needed for Africa by Africans as much as it's globalizing the system.
I suppose here, I would step out of Africa and go to where you started, into the broader global South, and encourage them to move from the understanding that research from the global South is quality research. It's just measured from different quality metrics. So don't start patronizing, start with an appreciative approach to research from the global South. And then I would encourage them to be much more intentional about how they evaluate quality on a much broader sense than what they currently do. And then I think we could help them by possibly forming a Global South Research Advancement Network, where we could help them as a community to reflect on steps and activities that could help them to be more intentional. For example, Lancet has taken the view to reject submissions that use data obtained, they happen to say Africa, but it could possibly be the Global South, without the necessary acknowledgement of scholars in those geographies. And this is something that is a small thing to do, but has a powerful message about intellectual appropriation that is taking place currently. Yeah, so those are some of the things that we can work on. So I would say maybe an action item for us, Dan, is let's talk about a Global South Research Advancement Network. We'll add a whole host of stuff in there, including, for example, how to help scholars in the Global South think about collaborating together, South-South ties around raising research funding and doing some really exciting work, which would result in truly societal impact research from our communities.
Wow, what a great place to end, and with a big warm thank you to you, Morris, for being here and sharing all of this. I want to thank Sherwatt for sharing about the conference in January, and this may be a great place to start. So we encourage people to submit their proposals to the Academy, the African Academy of Management in Cape Town. We're going to be down in your neck of the woods, Morris, very, very soon. And thanks to others, Lana, we have been recording this and we will share it. And looking at all of the comments, I can't read them all so quickly, but we appreciate them all. And I just want to end by saying what a great privilege it is for us at the Global Business School Network to work with the Africa Academy of Management. I want to thank Bella and others who have joined us from the African Academy of Management as we all join together in this community, and thanking Morris for his, I think, not only very interesting and insightful comments, at times provocative, which we like and we value for the opportunity it creates for us to get better at doing research, and research that matters. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you at the next AFAM GBSN webinar.